I'd like to ask uh, the Boston necklace connecting all the parks and playground in Boston. And I get to walk 25,000 steps a day. And people who plan healthy cities, healthy places recommend that we should have 10,000 steps a day to stay healthy. In Hong Kong, with those interconnected elevated walkways, how many steps a day you walk?
As many as you want, I guess. Yeah, look, interesting question. I mean, I imagine it would encourage a lot more activity. I think you get that sense that things are more proximate to you, you're more likely to walk to them. I think if you feel, okay, my neighborhood has a hospital over there, I'll get a taxi or I'll get a bus. I think if you feel it's all there right with you, you will walk to it. And perhaps the journey feels shorter, you do more steps, you don't even notice.
If I may add, I've been measuring my steps. London, Paris, New York, Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo. I walk about 20 to 25,000 steps a day. In Manila, Makati, I walk only 2,000 steps a day. Because the green lights for pedestrians, only 10 seconds. If you are in high heels, you'll never make it. It's about 99 seconds for cars. And in Shinjuku, Tokyo, the same green light for pedestrians and vehicles. In Oxford Circus, London, it's about 40, 60. I don't know whether some of you are looking at the benefits of walkability in relation to health.
I think it's a really interesting point, though, isn't it? Because that's the minute you bring people together in a building like this, you are going to reduce the amount of time you spend walking, and people walk in places they want to walk. There's a great presentation by a man from Ogilvy and Mather called Rory Sutherland about high-speed rail, which is this incredibly expensive railway plan to the north of England, which I think is quite a good idea. He said, and it's going to cost about 30 billion or something. And he says, rather than spending 30 billion on making HS2 really far, is it less than that? 30 billion pounds, sorry. And so rather than spending 30 billion making HS2, cutting the journey time by an hour to the north of England, spend 10 million giving people free champagne and having beautiful staff serve drinks to them and making the seats really comfortable, showing movies, make it a really great journey. And then people won't mind it lasting longer. And I think that people like to walk in nice places. And if you give them places to walk, then they will walk. And you're right, they should do it to be healthier.
Thank you.
I'll say that you'll walk 50,000. I'm just going to put a number on it.
I like it. I think 50,000.
Nothing wrong with high-speed rail.
No, I like high-speed rail. I just think it's quite a good response to the problem.
Infrastructure is the answer to everything, actually. And the countries that are investing in infrastructure, like China, are on the way up. The ones that aren't investing in infrastructure, like big, are on the way down. And I'm afraid that's the reality.
Hi, this is a question for William. I noticed the other day in the plenary session you asked a question of the architects, the relationship of their marketing material. I wonder, I did quite enjoy the embracing of the new self-deprecating nomenclature for the buildings, but how do you, as the marketing agent, deal with the pressure to deliver the utopian community, and do you try to incorporate the more strong values of the buildings?
I asked the question. I'll go back to. I asked the question yesterday because I thought that we were losing sight of the fact that ultimately we have to be attractive to people, and that means selling, right? I mean, that's the truth of it. Means selling, but ultimately we need to be attractive to people. We need to have a story to people, for people to grab onto, and really successful projects have that story within them, and either it's because there is a really strong client who has a really strong view of what they're trying to achieve and they have a clear goal, or else it's because the architect does, or ideally it's when everybody does. And I tell all of my clients that I think the route to success is to have a vision and execute it with confidence, as I said with Irvine Cellar. And I find it completely extraordinary, the number of projects that I work on where hundreds of millions of dollars are being invested in, and quite far down the line. And you'll say, so who's this for? Oh, well, that's a good question. We haven't really thought about that. Or you say, they'll come to us and the building is coming out of the ground. They'll say, can you help us sell this? Tell us a story about this building. I'm like, honestly, you haven't got a story yet. You haven't thought about what you are delivering. And people don't. And it's beggars belief that people don't. But the really successful developers all over the world, the really successful projects, the really successful places, there's a story in there somewhere. And that's what we want to do, is try and pull out that story. And I spend most of my time trying to sit down with teams to get them to speak to each other, so that they can all go, oh yeah, that's what we're trying to do, isn't it? That's what we're trying to do. And again, I've worked on projects, they're halfway up. And then the first time anybody has sat in a room and talked about what they're trying to deliver is when we've asked them. And I cannot understand why people don't sit down right at the beginning and go, right, what do you want to get out of this? What is your lifelong objective? In 15 years, when you look back at this project, what will be your measure of success? Because that is really important, because we all bring our own personal ambitions. We all bring our own goals to projects. And to articulate that in the beginning so everybody understands it is critical, because, I think we need to, and that's what people buy, that's what people connect into. My point about yesterday's Skyline is that, it's that we get fixated on the form, because there are no other stories sometimes. I think we get to the point where we go, oh, this one's squiggly, that one's twisty, that one's got a hole in the top, that one's got a beautiful facade, and that's because there's nothing else to tell. So we have to do that, and there should be more to it. And I think what's been so brilliant about this, these few days, is that we've kept the same themes have been coming up, and it's about people and their experience of these places. And I've heard a couple of people say, should urban habitat come before tall buildings? The idea of hearing that 5 years ago, at this, it just wouldn't have happened. And I think we're moving in that direction. And people want stories. We all want to hear and buy in stories.
Can I add something to that? A lot of major projects are put out to competition, and in order to win a major competition, you have to have a story. I mean, the architects have to have a narrative, and they have to be able to tell the story, otherwise you don't win. So things are changing, and I'm surprised to hear you say that it's so bad, because in my world it's very competitive.
I think what's interesting is that there may be a story that the architect has, but that doesn't necessarily get shared with everybody else on the project. And you might get, and that could, and the part of what we do is try to spread that story so that people do understand what it is and it's communicated. And again, it's not always the case that everybody involved in it, that the agents who don't go and find out, or the sales teams aren't party to that, and the developer doesn't even know about it. It's held within one place, and it has to be shared more widely.
Well, I designed a building in London which is called the Crystal. I've always called it the Crystal, and my initial drawings were of crystals, and they spent £100,000 plus with marketing for them to come up with the idea of calling it the Crystal. And the client,
well, if you'll employ substandard marketing firms, Chris.
It was a big international conglomerate. But I mean, but I know you're wonderful. I mean, I do absolutely believe in what William says.
Do you think maybe we need to tell different stories as well? I mean, if you enter into this process saying, well, they just want some simple building-related story, well, that's what they'll get. Perhaps there's a more compelling, possibly more subtle, more difficult to communicate story, but that is equally valid.
I think you're right, and actually, but I think you started to tell that story, and I think lots of people have talked about that story today, which is moving beyond that idea of just these very simple, vertical floor plates, and actually trying to think about people's lives. And that is partly things have changed. And I say, I've got another presentation, which, if you've got more time, I can give on the future of the office. And it's a little bit about there's a little bit, we used to go into cathedral-sized receptions for office buildings because we were meant to be grateful for our jobs and go, oh, thank you, great organisation for giving me a job, thank you so much. And just like cathedrals, we were meant to quake in the face of our great employer. And now people don't feel like that anymore. They're like, oh, I like this place, don't like it, I'm off, I'm going somewhere else. I'll have 1,500 jobs. And so why do we still persist in making places that to make us feel small rather than to make us feel welcome and part of it? And I think we're moving in that direction where we do consider the individual, we consider what they care, how they want to live their lives, and all of that stuff. So I think everybody here. We've heard lots of ways of telling different stories and more compelling and more nuanced stories about place.
One question there at the back.
Yes, Glenn Blake Thomas again. Yesterday I glanced through the CTU, what was it called, the life cycle cost study that you've done for tall buildings, and in there they mentioned something to do with starting to look at embodied energy and the consumption of embodied energy in the production of tall buildings. What I'd like to ask all three of you is your opinion of what is the meaning of the word sustainability, and to what extent do you think it's going to be incorporated over the next 20 years?
That's a good question for the cocktail drinks, I think.
I've got a good response that my colleague of mine always says. If someone asks you what kind of relationship you want with your partner, do you say sustainable? I mean, it should be something more proactive, more positive, and more about, an aspiration rather than saying, it should just be sustainable. I'm not really giving you the answer you want, but
I think it's very difficult. Embodied energy, I mean, if you take a building like this, where do you start? It's a huge amount of materials produced all over the world. So the energy involved is enormous. And I'm sure this is a highly efficient building in its own right. And in sustainability terms, that's what you tend to think about, rather than the embodied energy, which is a very, very complex issue that I don't think anyone could fully appreciate or understand.
Yeah, I think that that it's so complicated. The minute you start occupying a building, the whole process changes anyway, right? But I'm going to skirt it slightly and say what is really exciting about sustainability, whatever that means, is that it's now become a tick box, and actually all the projects we work on, it's hard. It's not a selling point anymore. You can't. I mean, there was 5-10 years ago, it'd be like, oh, it's super green, it's platinum this, it's excellent that, it's outstanding this, and look at the green features. Now it's just you've got to do it. If you don't do it, you will wipe out a whole marketplace, particularly in commercial buildings, and that's what it should be, right? It should be standard.